use wax, some use oil, some use wax, some use polyurethane, lacquer, some apply by hand, some spray it. Looking at this, to try to narrow it down, I went on to the AAW website and looked at their index for the magazine. They got 2.5 pages of entries for finishing. Now, a lot of the entries are tips. So if you look at them, they're just a tip. Well, I did this and I did that, but they don't go into real detail as to why they did what they did. But there are a few articles on there that go completely through the various steps that most turners go through. So I picked one.
Excuse me, Bill.
Yes.
You gave me that thumbnail with it on. Is it okay if I send this out to all the members?
Sure.
Oh.
Sure. Let's see here. So like I said, I picked one of the articles that dealt with the complete series of steps that most turners go through. I modified it a little bit because I didn't like the order that they used, but this one article, One Turner's Guide to Finishing, by Peter Smith, is the one I modeled this talk after. These are the 5 steps that this individual goes through. There's initial sanding, and we're not going to go into detail on that. That's a whole other talk. There's oiling and sealing, and putting a primary finish on it, and then polishing and buffing. Uh-oh. Let's see. On the initial sanding, like I said, we don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's pretty obvious what you do. You sand it to a certain point. Now, you have to consider whether you're sanding a hardwood or a softwood, because you don't want to sand it so much that you have a completely smooth surface. If it's too smooth, then some of these finishes may not stick to it, or not stick well. So but you do an initial sanding to get rid of the tool marks and that type of thing. Everybody knows this. The second step is what we call oiling, what this individual Smith called oiling. The oils that you normally see are linseed oil, tongue oil, walnut oil. Those are what they call drying oils, meaning that when they're exposed to oxygen and heat to some extent, they'll polymerize. And then you have what I call hybrid oils. Danish oil is not one thing, and we're going to look at that. Then you have tongue oil finish. If you look at some of the products that are on the market, and if you don't look close, you think you're buying or you're using tongue oil. But no, it's tongue oil finish. And more than likely, it doesn't have any tongue oil in it at all. We're going to look at that too. Let's see. This is the only chemistry I'm going to talk about, but I want to emphasize this. Almost any finish that you put on a surface forms a polymer. If it's a linseed oil, it'll react with the oxygen in the air, form a polymer of the compounds that are in the linseed oil. There's not just one compound, there are multiple compounds in linseed oil. So what is it? What is a polymer? You start off with something simple, like this penguin here, and it's called a monomer. When it polymerizes, all of these monomers come together and form thousands and thousands of polymers. So it could be represented like a penguin and a whole group of penguins, except they're not just grouped together, they're actually linked together, chemically linked together. Can you see?
You're fine, yeah.
The reason I put this up here is because we're working with wood, and wood is composed mainly of cellulose, stuff called lignin, and another thing called hemicellulose. Cellulose is made initially from the monomer glucose, the same glucose that your body uses to produce energy. But when you polymerize that, you get, you get the polymer cellulose. So, all right,
That yellow button should be your laser.
okay. Oh, good. Yeah.
I've seen that cartoon.
So when the glucose polymerizes and all this stuff hooks together, you get cellulose, and that's the wood that you're working with. About 30 or 40% of
Can I
it.
just try this for a minute? to see?
Okay.
Is that better back there? Perfect. Maybe it's my camera, I don't know.
Okay. About 30, 40% of it is cellulose, which is a polymer. So you're dealing with polymers all the time. Let's talk about linseed oil. When it's used as linseed oil, it dries slowly and then it hardens. It actually soaks into the wood as opposed to polyurethane or varnish. Linseed oil and tung oil and walnut oil are soaking into the wood. They're not laying on the surface unless you build it up. You could build it up and have it lay on the surface. But for the most part, it's soaking into the oil. And this is a typical example is what you find at Home Depot. It says boiled linseed oil. We'll look at that a little bit more. Where does linseed oil come from? Linseed oil comes from a seed, from the flax plant. And if you crush that seed and just crush it and get the oil out of it, you get flaxseed oil. And this is edible. Flaxseed oil is edible. And it contains omega-3 fatty acids, which are essential for our health. So initially, when linseed oil is produced, you're crushing the seed and getting the flaxseed oil. But then you go further and you extract the rest of that oil with a solvent. And at that point, it's not edible anymore because you do not want that to take that solvent into your system. And that's where you get your boiled linseed oil. So boiled linseed oil refers to a combination of raw linseed oil, flaxseed, stan oil, and metallic dryers. The stan oil is produced from linseed oil by heating it up in the absence of oxygen. And it's heated up 300 degrees centigrade, which is about 572 degrees Fahrenheit. So it really gets hot. But it causes it to polymerize, and it also causes it to thicken. It becomes a much thicker product. And so when you buy your linseed oil in Home Depot, what you're buying is a combination of these things right here. Raw linseed oil, this stan oil to thicken it up, and these metallic dryers. These metallic dryers are used to help the chemicals in the linseed oil, the flaxseed oil, to polymerize. If you don't have them in there, it would take much longer for this stuff to polymerize. So you have to have the metallic dryers. Now, at one time, these were lead compounds, and obviously lead compounds can be quite dangerous, especially if you're not aware and you're putting this on something that would be used in a food situation. They have since changed that. They're no longer lead compounds, but they are cobalt and zirconium and that type of thing. There's probably not a lot of it in there, and it probably won't hurt you, but you need to be aware that if you're using linseed oil, it's something that you're eating off of, or you're putting food on, that they don't evaporate. They're there to some extent. Tung oil. Tung oil is also a vegetable type oil. It comes from nature. It comes from the tung tree. It doesn't come from a whale or a whale's tongue or anything like that. It comes from the tung tree. Again, just like linseed oil, it hardens on exposure to air because it has a lot of the same compounds that linseed oil has. All of these compounds that are coming out of nature have a lot of the same things. They just have different proportions of them. So, it said it's very popular today because it's considered a green oil. It dries quickly, and supposedly, at least according to this one author, it will completely polymerize, 100%, whereas linseed oil will never ever harden. So if you're putting linseed oil on it and it's soaking into your wood, it's going to polymerize, but not totally. Whereas tung oil, which is more expensive than linseed oil, but it will polymerize. And it'll give probably a better finish overall. This is what I was talking about earlier. You see, it says tung oil finish. That doesn't have any tung oil in it. It's a marketing technique. So if you're going to use tung oil, make sure you buy something. You can't hardly see this, but right there it says 100% tung oil. So make sure if you're going to use this, you don't use this something like this because it's linseed oil in there. Linseed oil with other things. Danish oil. Danish oil is not a single thing. It is either tung oil or linseed oil. And it's mixed with some sort of wood finish, varnish or lacquer. It does the same thing. It does polymerize, but it's not a compound like you would say tung oil or linseed oil. It's a mixture of linseed oil and or tung oil and a varnish. We'll talk about what varnishes are. This is one I ran across. I'd never heard of this stuff. It's pronounced ho-ho-pom, like Grumpy Santa Claus. Somebody said that they were using this on a lot of toys that they were producing for children. It's a natural oil. It comes from a plant out in the Southwest, and it will not harden. It's not like linseed oil. It's not like tung oil. It's more like mineral oil. But if you compare mineral oil structure, chemicals in mineral oil to the chemicals in this, they're completely different. And this will give you a better surface, a surface that you could possibly buff as opposed to using mineral oil. But it's something I want to make you aware of, because evidently people are starting to use this stuff. It's not expensive. Like I said, it comes out of, it's a product of the United States, and it comes out of the Southwest, California, Nevada, that area. Okay, step 3, shellac and lacquer. Almost everybody uses shellac, and I want to spend some time talking about shellac, because shellac has been around a long time, but there may be some misunderstanding about it. And then lacquer. Lacquer is a man-made product. Many of these things, polyurethane and that type of thing, are all man-made products, and really they come from the plastic industry. Many of the chemicals that are there were originally designed to make plastics, and by changing the formula somewhat, you can have a finish put on wood. But as many of you know, they say that a lot of these finishes look like plastic on wood, and that's why, because they were really designed to be plastics. All right, shellac. Shellac has been around for thousands and thousands of years. Probably not in the form we're used to using, but it's been around. But it really didn't start being used until the mid-1600s on furniture and that type of thing. Zinsser is the main producer of shellac in this country. Shellac is used for many, many things. Shellac is edible. Shellac is non-toxic. And
a lot of fruits and vegetables are coated with shellac.
Exactly.
And candies too.
These are the order in which shellac is used. Pharmaceuticals, a lot of the pills and tablets that you see on the market are coated with shellac to keep moisture away from them. Confectionery, hats, I guess at one time they were using stiffen up hats, and food coatings. And that's in the order from highest to the lowest. Wood only comes into play as number 8. So shellac is used for a lot of things. And you can imagine that you have to produce a lot of shellac to cover all these areas. Where does it come from? It comes from this bug. This bug is called a lac bug. The shellac bug produces a resin that is deposited on the bark of trees. And then that resin is scraped off the trees and processed to give you shellac. And according to these sources, it takes a lot of bugs to produce just 1 kilogram of raw shellac, if you will. A kilogram is about 2.2 pounds.
And that's edible, huh?
Not at this point.
Oh.
This is the resin. This is what's on the tree. This is a picture. All these modules on this trunk of this tree are the resin that these bugs are producing. As it's processed, as it goes through a process, it comes out as sheets. And those sheets are then further processed into the type of thing that we see when we buy it, almost. Here are some examples of shellac. Shellac comes in many forms, many colors. You can go all the way from these dark shellacs to the bleach shellac and the orange shellac. If you go online, you can find companies that will sell you any of these things in bags like this. You can also go to Rockler and Woodcraft, and you can get more processed shellac. And these are the most common. You have what they call the blonde shellac, the garnet shellac, and the orange shellac. These are the common ones. So shellac normally is a solid. It's not a liquid, it's a solid material. And you take this solid material and you dissolve it to get the shellac to put on your wood products. Like I said, Zinsser is the #1 company that you'll find for shellac that is already in solution. And they pretty much only produce the clear and the amber. It's the largest manufacturer in the country, and there's a lifespan to the material that they produce, and it's about 3 years. You would say, well, how will I know what it is? How long has it been? How old is it? That stamp, if you ever look on the top of the can, you'll see this stamp right here. And that stamp is a date code. And that date code can be broken down into the first number after the letter is the year the shellac was made. So if it had a 7 there, it'd be this year. If it had a 0 there, it'd be 2000. The second number is the month, and the third number is the day that it was produced. So they break it down that much. And they recommend that beyond 3 years, you don't want to be messing with it because it'll never really set up. So let's look at this one. 09166. The 0 is year 2000. First number after the S. The 9, September. And then the day of the month is the 16th. So that's good information to know. If you go into Home Depot, just look at that date code. Make sure you're getting something that's fresh. If you make your own, then you're buying the solid and you have to dissolve it. Now, shellac is dissolved in alcohol. It's not dissolved in mineral spirits or lacquer thinner. It's dissolved in alcohol. And chemically, those things are completely different. Shellac won't dissolve in mineral spirits. But what you would need, if you decide to make your own, you're going to need a scale. You're going to have to weigh it out because you need what they call a pound cut, and we're going to look at that. You'll need the solvent. Like I said, it's alcohol. If you want to put a dye in it, these are alcohol-soluble dyes. So since you're using alcohol or dissolvent, you can also use alcohol-soluble dyes to color it. And then the other things are just containers and that type of.
You grind up the flakes with the grinder first.
Yes, it's a good idea to grind it up because usually the flakes are about the size of your thumbnail. And you want to help the dissolving process because it doesn't go to solution right away. You can grind it up. You don't want to heat it, but grind it up. If you heat it, I wouldn't recommend heating it because you cause it to polymerize on it. Plus it's alcohol and catch on fire. All right. If you go into Home Depot or Lowe's, you will see a can like this, or a can like this, or a can like this, or a can like this. Every one of them said natural alcohol. Every one of them. They're not the same. These cans contain mainly methyl alcohol. Methyl alcohol is wood alcohol. It's the simplest alcohol chemically. It's very cheap. It'll dissolve the shellac, and it's used a lot, but it is not really designed to be safe. Wood alcohol is something that people that are addicted to alcohol, what they call winos, if you will, used to try to drink this stuff, and they go blind from drinking it. And that's the effect it has on the body. So if you're making your own and use one of these, then you're breathing that. Now, whether you apply it, I don't know, but it's a risk I wouldn't want to take. So be aware that these so-called denatured alcohols are not ethyl alcohol. Ethyl alcohol is drinkable alcohol, and that's what this is. This green label up here indicates that it's environmental friendly, if you will. And you can buy it at Home Depot. I've never seen gallons of this, but I've seen these pint sizes. It's not that expensive. So if you decide you want to make your own shellac, I would recommend that you definitely buy this one here because it is.
Which?
It is ethyl
The green
alcohol.
one.
Ethyl alcohol.
You mean the green one, you were pointing to the middle one.
I'm sorry.
You want the green one is when you want to buy it for.
Right. Yes, you want to buy this one. Now it is denatured because if it wasn't denatured, it would be taxed. Since it's ethyl alcohol, which is drinkable alcohol, it would be a heavy tax on it. So they put something in it, not a lot. They put something in it to denature it, but it's still mainly ethyl alcohol. Now the way you find out about what's in these things, you can look at what they call an MSDS, this Material Safety Data Sheet. If you go on any of these products, you can go in and find what they really are. And you'll see they're mixtures. Mixtures of alcohols. They're not just one alcohol. So I think that's important to realize. When you're dealing with shellac, you normally hear the phrase pound cut. A pound cut, and this is throughout the industry, is weight per volume. So if you put 3 pounds of shellac and 1 gallon of ethyl alcohol, you have a 3-pound cut. The alcohol that you buy in Home Depot is a 3-pound cut. And normally what you would do, you would not use it straight. It's too thick. You don't want to use that material straight out of the can. you want to cut it down to at least a 1 pound cut. So dilute it out with ethyl alcohol to 2 to 1. 2 to 1. I saw this, and I was sort of impressed by this because it struck me that even though you have different colors of the shellac that have been made up, this is cherry wood, this is pine wood, and you can see if you put the clear, this is the color you're going to get. With the amber, you're going to get this. The blonde, you're going to get this. The orange and the garnet, even though the garnet is almost black, you're not creating a black surface. So if you decide to make your own and you buy garnet thinking you're going to get a real dark shellac finish, it's not going to happen. About 2 years ago in fine woodworking, there was an advertisement for this stuff called Royal Lac. And supposedly this company, which you can go online, shellacfinishes.com, has created this product, and it's mainly shellac, but they've also put a resin in it. And by doing so, they've made it much more durable, because shellac will cloud over in moisture situations. And by putting this resin in it, according to the literature on this, that won't happen. So if you're not going to use shellac just as a sealer, but you're going to use it as your final finish, you might want to consider looking at this. This may be something worth looking at. And if you look at that website, shellacfinishes.com, there's a lot of information about shellac and how it's produced and that type of thing. It's sort of expensive, but it's not that expensive. Okay. For the most part, we've been talking about using shellac as a sealer. So most people will put linseed oil on it, let it dry, maybe put another coat on, let it dry, sand it a little bit, and then put the shellac on it to seal. Again, if you go to Home Depot, you can buy shellac, like we saw earlier. But you can also buy sanding sealer, and that's shellac too. So essentially you're buying the same thing. But if you'll notice, if you look at the two different products, the shellac, if you shake it up and then let it sit, stuff will settle out of the material. Whereas a sanding sealer, that doesn't happen, even though it's shellac. And the reason is they have a different solvent in there. And if you're going to strictly use shellac as a sealer, I would recommend using the sanding sealer. Don't just use straight shellac, because it's harder to work with and it doesn't evaporate as quickly. Step 4, primary finish. You can skip a lot of this, like I said, and stop it at the oiling stage. You can stop at the shellac stage, or you can put a primary finish on it, such as a varnish or a lacquer. Now here again, these terms can be somewhat misleading. What is a varnish? By definition, in the industry, the finishing industry, by definition, a varnish has a drying oil in it, usually linseed oil. It has a resin of some type. This resin is a urethane, acrylic, something along those lines, man-made material, and it has a solvent. And the solvent is usually mineral spirits or turpentine. The solvents can be pretty toxic, as you well know. I mean, you don't want to be breathing a lot of this material when you're using a varnish, because these solvents are coming from the petroleum industry, and when petroleum is refined, it's cut into what they call fractions, and these solvents can be quite detrimental to it if you breathe a lot of this. So like I said, the resin that is in the material can be a urethane, it can be another chemical it's a group. It's called an alkyd. It can be a vinyl or acrylic. These are the biggies. These are the big materials that are used in the paint industry. And they are not one thing. A urethane can be many different things, but it is still a urethane. And so when you buy products, that say a wipe-on polyurethane, you get what you pay for. If you buy a cheap polyurethane, then more than likely the urethanes with an S are not the same as if you buy a more expensive urethane. And I think a perfect example, and Jerry could probably attest to this, is a lot of the paint used on cars are acrylics. Is that right?
Not any longer. Polyurethanes, mainly.
Well, okay, then polyurethane, but the difference, the reason they cost so much is because, well, not only the solvents that they're in, but because of the refined urethane or acrylic that's in there. It's not a whole mixture. It's more limited. And they do that so you can get a more consistent finish. So just be aware that when you're buying a varnish and you're buying a polyurethane or polyacrylic, that if you're buying a real cheap one, you may have problems with it. How does a varnish differ from a lacquer? What's the difference? Well, the big difference is it doesn't have oil in it. Lacquers are considered, again, this is by definition in the paint industry, they are a binder, if you will, a resin, and a thinner. That's all they are. And it can be polyurethane, it could be acrylic, it could be alkyd, it could be any of those I just mentioned. But all it is that resin along with something to dissolve it. And if you've ever used any spelling lacquer thinner, it is very detrimental to breathe. It's much worse than mineral spirits. And these are some of the things that you normally see in lacquer thinners. These are dangerous. So if you're using this material to any extent, you need to have a mask with an organic filter on it. Definitely have to have that. About 15 years ago, the world woke up that all of these solvents that paints are dissolved in are detrimental to the environment. And because of that, the industry started looking for ways to get around it. And what they came up with is waterborne finishes. These finishes are completely different than what you've been using. And the actual application is completely different. But basically what it is, it's a resin. It can be an acrylic, it can be a urethane, it can be a mixture of those. Dissolved in water as the solvent, along with a couple of things to keep it in the water, because oil and water don't mix. And these resins are essentially, you would think of them as oils. They're not going to mix with water unless you add something to them. And so there are things put in there to keep them in suspension. Those things are surfactants and this, what they call the glycol ether. If you look at the product, if you look at water-based finishes, they look like milk. They're milky because it's an emulsion, it's a suspension. The resin is suspended in the water. And again, the reason they're using water is because when it vaporizes, it's not toxic. And so more and more companies, and especially if you deal in large volumes of paint, are trying to develop and come up with waterborne finishes. Here are some of the advantages. They have what they call a high solid content. In other words, with a lacquer, you may only have 15–20% solid resin, whereas waterborne, you'll have a lot more solid, a lot more resin that you're actually putting onto the surface of your piece. Supposedly they're fast drying. I question that, especially in a humid situation. You're evaporating water, so if it's very humid, it's not going to dry very fast. But at least according to this thing, they are fast drying. Minimal fumes, like I said, easy cleanup, soap and water, pretty hard. They don't yellow, there's no fire hazard, and they're less polluting. Those are the reasons they're going to waterborne solvents. What are the cons? According to this, the bland appearance. I've only done one piece with a waterborne solvent, and I don't think it had a bland appearance. It looked okay to me. I thought it was very difficult to use, but you know, you can take it for what it's worth.
Would it cause the grain of the wood to rise?
Say again?
Would it cause the grain of the wood to rise?
Yeah, I think it's right here. Raises the wood grain.
Okay.
Right here. All in all, what they're saying here is that water-based finishes have a way to go. And I can tell you, at least from my experience there, it's a challenge to use it. It's much more difficult to use. This is a water-based finish. It's made by General Finishes. General Finishes is a company, you can't buy it locally here. You have to order it. But that company makes very high quality finishes that woodworkers use. And you can see that Fine Woodworking gave it a Best Overall Choice Award for this waterborne finish that they created. So it's something you might want to consider if you're adventuresome. See how milky it looks? All of them look that way because it's a suspension. It's not in total solution. All right, you've made your choices to what finish you're going to put onto it, and now you're ready to wax it. A lot of waxes, and a lot of waxes, a lot of different waxes. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them come from nature. So like linseed oil, tongue oil, walnut oil. They come from different parts of the plant, by definition, they're organic compounds. They're hydrophobic, meaning they don't like water. Malleable, meaning you can dent it. They're not soluble in water. And like I said, they come from plants, animals, or petroleum. So what is a wax from an animal? Beeswax. Beeswax. People use a lot of beeswax, and it comes from bees. What is a vegetable wax? An example is a carnauba wax. Carnauba wax comes from the leaves of a carnauba palm. So it's a natural wax that occurs in nature, just like the beeswax.
That's used on M&Ms, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah, it's
Carnauba wax is used on M&Ms.
popular on cars too.
Right. So you can eat a car, it won't help you around.
And you also have, from the petroleum industry, you have what they call paraffin wax. These waxes, since they come from nature, have similar characteristics. They have similar compounds, different ratios. This paraffin wax coming from petroleum is completely different chemically, completely different. It's not a drying wax. It won't dry. It'll just essentially lay on the surface. From the petroleum industry, there's a wax that's being generated called microcrystalline wax. Here are a couple of examples: resonance wax and this one here. At one time, many of the museums were using wax to protect a lot of their exhibits, not only wood, but other things too. And they found, because the waxes have what they call organic acids in them, that they were deteriorating the material that they were putting it on. So what they came up with is, and what's being used by many museums now, is this Renaissance wax, not resins, Renaissance wax. And it is what they call a microcrystalline wax. It's a paraffin wax coming from petroleum industry, but it is molecularly, it has crystals. Crystals that are much finer, and so you get a different finish when you put it on. And like I said, the majority of museums are using this stuff now. You can buy it from Rockford. I think Rockford has it, but you can certainly buy it. It's not hard to find. So it's something you might want to consider if you ever want to switch waxes. If you don't like the carnauba wax, you can try this. Here's another view of it. Like I said, it's used for on antiques. I ran across this when I was looking at waxes. If you're a pen maker, you probably know what this is. This is sold as a wax abrasive combination. There's an abrasive in these waxes, and a lot of the pen makers use this to put on pens, because it not only polishes it actually puts a surface wax on. Some of the people, we sent out an email and asked for questions that I could possibly answer at the end of this presentation. And a couple of people wrote back and wanted to know about what they call a Japan dryer and wood hardener. And somebody was asking about how to store finishes. This is the Japan dryer you can buy in Home Depot. And what it is the drying part, the dryers that are in linseed oil. That's what this is. It's not linseed oil. It's the dryers that are put into linseed oil to cause it to polymerize. You follow me? The reason it's called Japan dryer is because of this. The name is referring to Japanning, a term for use of drying oils as an imitation or substitution for your Russian oil and Japanese lacquer. You know, the Japanese have at one time, they have a very unique process where they would coat their material with this black resin. And it's not an oil, it's a resin that they get from a plant. And that's why this is called a Japan dryer, because they're trying to imitate that. It's a very difficult process to do.
On that Japan
That's about
dryer,
as clear as mud. Huh?
if I could mention, B. Sky taught me this, I didn't. Boiled linseed oil, bronze usually they have a bucket of boiled linseed oil and mineral spirits, and you put your nip in there and leave it for whatever, take it out, it takes 3 weeks or a week or whatever to dry. If you put this stuff on the Norfolk, right after you take it out of the boiled linseed oil, it dries in like a day. So it was amazing. He said that, I couldn't believe I tried it. It really does work. In a day, that boiled linseed oil bowl will dry a day, 2 days, where it would have taken 3 weeks if you just let it air dry. And that just when I was a kid, my grandfather did a lot of painting. He worked in a paint shop, and he painted our house, inside, and there was that smell that I always remember as a kid, and that's what it was. Because I think back then, they used to put this in their paint to make it dry faster.
Right.
That's enough.
Yeah, well, that's what it's for. I mean, it's designed to dry or cause the oils, linseed oil or whatever, to polymerize. And there's a certain amount of it in the boiled linseed oil that you buy at Home Depot, but this is a concentrated form. And so if you put that on there, it will certainly cause it to polymerize a lot quicker. But remember what it is. It's cobalt, zirconium, salts of compounds. Cobalt and zirconium, these are what they call heavy metals. So you've got to be aware of it, what you're working with. Okay. This wood hardener. It's a solvent containing a resin, essentially. Now, what the resin is, I have no idea. Because if you go online and try to look at the MSD, the only thing the MSD lists are things that are hazardous to your health. They don't tell you other things that are in there unless it's hazardous. So if you go online and look at the MSDS of this, what you see is acetone and methanol. Well, that's the solvent, but what's the resin? I don't know. I have no idea. But the reason it works, the reason it hardens, is because you're putting a resin, such as a polyurethane or an acrylic, dissolved in acetone and methanol on the wood. When that evaporates, it hardens.
It soaks in.
Pardon?
It soaks in.
Yeah.
It gets real deep.
Right. So again, if you use that, that's essentially what you're doing. I mean, this stuff's pretty expensive. So if you just get adventurous, you could take some polyurethane and dilute it way down and probably get the same effect. Lance asked about how do you preserve finishes. Well, I've seen articles where people will put marbles into the container to take up the space, the space that where you use a certain amount of the finish. You want to get rid of the air because air is going to cause it to polymerize and harden. So they'll put marbles in there which won't react with anything, and it causes the finish to come up and essentially eliminate most of the air. But they do make chemicals, and this is one of the chemicals that is used. Not that that means anything to you, but there are chemicals that are put into paints to react with these drying agents. The drying agents, which are causing it to dry, react with this compound, and then they can't cause your finish to dry. But when that compound evaporates, they're there. So that's why it's used. And then that's the concept behind it. What is this? I've got two handouts. If you take the time to read them, the first one pretty much goes through these steps that I talked about. And it was written by a guy that has been in the finishing industry a long, long time. And I'm sure did a much better job than what I just did. So I made a copy of that for you. And there's also another one in there that has a chart comparing some of these things and also talks about a couple of other finishes that are on the market and are used by Turners. And folks, that is it. Anything I could answer?
Yeah, question. Sander sealer. I watch the YouTube on it, and they'll just slop it on, and I worry that if I put it on, it's going to sink into the different grains, and I'm going to have gray mixed in with the finish. I talked with Gary on this, and he says when Minwax used to have an oil sander sealer, things worked good, but the water sander sealer does nothing. Now, I only know the second half. I don't see any advantage to it. Can you explain?
Well, the sander sealer that I was talking about initially is not water-based. It is solvent, organic solvent-based.
Can you turn this on?
The one I was talking about initially, and it's shellac and alcohol, what it
Okay.
is. And the water-based sanding sealer is probably not shellac. I don't know what it is, but it's probably not shellac, because like I said earlier, once you start using water, you've got to take your resin, whatever your resin is, and be able to suspend it in the water. Well, shellac doesn't do well with water. Since shellac is a mixture of things, it will essentially just fall apart in water. So more than likely your water-based sanding sealer is a resin of some type, an acrylic of some type, and it's not shellac. My gut feeling is it's not shellac.
Okay.
Don't they, you know, alcohol will bind with water.
To a certain extent, yes.
Yeah, it will bind with water. We use it to get rid of water in gas tanks. You pour a quart of alcohol in and it binds with the water and then it burns out with gasoline.
Right.
Right now, if that's true, then why wouldn't water bind with the alcohol and the shellac and actually become part of the mixture?
Alcohol when it not reacts, but when it hooks up with water,
It
forms
mixes
what they
with
call
Right.
an azeotropic solution. In other words, if you're distilling something or evaporating it,
Right.
the most you can get is 95% alcohol and the rest is water. And the only way to get rid of that water is through a different process. It will not distill. It will go to 95%, but the rest is always going to be water. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
They have things like what they call molecular sieves, and if you take 95% alcohol and you put it in on top of the molecular sieve, the water will go inside the molecular sieve and leave 100% alcohol. But if you expose that 100% alcohol to moisture, it will regain that moisture and equilibrate to 95%. So it will pick up water.
Many decades ago, I remember reading about sanding sealer. And the point behind sanding sealer is that it's for sanding. The idea is that it's, after you apply it, as you sand it turns to dust rather than gumming up your sandpaper. And so it's designed to be sanded off. Basically, it goes in, it fills the little voids, but whatever you sand off turns to dust. So
Yeah, sure.